What's the Big Idea? The Third Generation of Policies for Economic Growth, written by David Lindsay and Lance Pritchett, presented by James Donegan, Joseph Kelly, Anthony Harmon MacDonald, and Katrina O'Connor. The overall objective of this paper was to highlight the failures of growth models presented by economists in the past, and to offer a new and alternative approach to economic growth recommendations in the form of diagnostic decision-making. The authors approach the complex path of development by dividing the previous approaches into two contrasting platforms of big ideas. They then introduce a third generation of big ideas that will influence the way future economists approach economic growth. The intention of the paper is the introduction of a new approach to growth and development that emphasizes the work of the Washington Consensus, instilling the idea that no one exact path or method to growth. The different policies and regimes will work in different times and places. Lindsay and Pritchett are aware of the mistakes of past economists, acknowledging their arrogance in assuming their one remedy to ensuring fast and effective development in states. They acknowledge that the route to sustainable development should consider more than just economic factors, and that there are social contributors to the success and longevity of growth and development, and policies must be adjusted accordingly. Conceptually, the paper divides itself into two sections. In the beginning, by taking a historical analysis of the big ideas used by economists in the 1960s and the 1980s. The paper not only explains to the reader the period of economic thinking, but asks the reader to identify themselves within the period, explaining the economic and social climate in which these opinions and decisions were made, and then ask them to apply the knowledge to a Latin American example. This is an important step within the paper. While it introduces the mistakes of the past economists, the authors are already introducing the idea to the reader that to make decisions regarding economic policies, they should be considering more than just the economic climate. The second phase of the paper looks at 2002 and introduces a third period of economic growth ideas that move on from the blanket policies of the past. It is the introduction of a diagnostic decision tree, following on from the Washington Consensus. Following the period after 1982 and the big facts of that time, the authors call for each country should develop their own economic policies that are based on their personal and specific cultural, geographical, political, and economic needs. The use of empirical studies of Latin America explores why blanket policies utilized across states are not satisfactory in ensuring economic growth that can be sustained across time. The key hypothesis of the paper is that a more varied approach to the growth in the future will aid in the avoidance of policy mistakes that have been made in the past as a result of only focusing on economic contributors. The period of the 1960s big ideas follow recommendations of heavy government intervention and control, encouragement of industrialization, and the accumulation and government borrowing as central to the development process. There was a call to avoid foreign direct investment, and that little advantage could be seen to increase reliance on trade beyond that of importing capital goods. The 1980s, however, also convinced of their big ideas, called for a complete contrary set of policies that they believed the key to achieving universal growth and development. This period of growth trends calls for a less intense role from governments, believing it necessary but obstructive, a higher level of private sector investment, and placed heavy importance on trade and integration, asking for an avoidance of government borrowing but an increase in foreign direct investment. Lindsay and Pritchett look back on past events and recommendations with the knowledge of present circumstances. They can analyse the big ideas of yesterday with the awareness of the big facts of today. The conclusion they draw from this is retrospective analysis, is that policies of the past were far too imprecise to ensure sustained economic growth. The narrow spectrum of consideration meant that important factors were overlooked. The paper offers a paradoxical analysis of the steps for growth and development, that careful consideration by economists is more necessary than ever to approach growth sustainably. However, economic theories are less important, as we argue that a more varied and inclusive evaluation of circumstance on a case-by-case basis will lead to a more appropriate policy recommendations.
The article uses historical observations and empirical evidence as a method for analyzing the concepts and arguments provided. The reader is asked to picture themselves in different generations, 1962 and 1982, as someone who has been given the task of advising growth policies, i.e., big ideas, for developing countries, perhaps as a professional economist or a policymaker. The insights that provided the popular mindset at the time of what are the factors that have been contributing to growth are described. For instance, in 1962, you may have been more likely to consider socialism highly capable and proficient in transforming countries into economic superpowers from taking note of the Soviet Union's high standing in your current world. You likely would have reflected on it once being politically and socially backward before socialism. The authors then juxtaposed this historical outlook with the historical outlook 20 years later, emphasizing changes in the world that were unanticipated for, such as debt crises, rapid growth in Asian countries, and the Soviet Union not imposing as much of a presence as it had in the past. Also a popular mindset during 1962 was that the government was a driving force for development. This would have come from having lived through World War II and having witnessed the effect of planning, mobilization, and expansion in economic activity achieved by the government during wartime. However, 20 years later, economists at the time would have bear witness to the failure of central planning in countries that it had been implemented in, such as Cuba and India, and see that instead of being critical for development, it can actually be detrimental to it. Evidently, this method of juxtaposing two eras works very well in demonstrating Linder and Pritchett's arguments that there should be more to policy formation than just observation of the present and the past. In addition, the evidence provided complements the author's method. Reports from the World Bank are used to show slow growth rates as a result of central planning, as mentioned, and are also cited to demonstrate the prominent ideas during 1962 and 1982 under development assistance and the role of multilaterals heading in the summary tables. Moreover, since the article is largely focused on a historical outlook, accurate historical data is important. The facts are backed up in the footnotes provided. However, since certain data may not have been available at the time, the article sometimes references more recent papers that have researched the numbers to come up with a sufficient estimate. For instance, Angus Madison's book, Monitoring the World Economy, 1820 to 1992, Washington Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, gathered extensive research of the global economy throughout the modern era and is used for the growth rate numbers for the United States, Germany, Austria, Italy, and France in 1962, as exact numbers are not available for the period discussed. For the creation of the diagnostic tree for policy advice, the choice of the 5 elements, current level of income, current status of growth, linkages with the world economy, government strength, and government capacity, are backed up by evidence to support their inclusion. For current levels of income, the authors note that rapid growth rates does not apply to all levels of income, as seen from China, India, and Vietnam's growth, whilst for government capacity, the author notes Taiwan's success as a low-income country with the traits of limited protection and a strong government capacity as an example to justify creating a branch for that element.
Linder and Pritchett draws from established literature, such as the Washington Consensus and the Growth Diagnostic Framework. The Washington Consensus was developed in the 1990s in the form of 10 so-called commandments set out to allow for economic development. However, it did not fully work in Latin America, even though it was followed very closely, and it tackled inflation in Mexico and Argentina. There weren't much other results of note. Compared to East Asia, where the consensus was nowhere nearly as neatly followed, yet had greater success. Many countries picked 3 or 4 different policies and then kind of made up or applied to do their own needs at the time. This is seen in the form of China's annual growth rate between 1982 and 1999, averaging at 5.8%, while India, as growing slowly, relatively, was growing at 3.6%. Still, it also draws on the Growth Diagnostic Framework. This was meant to be a binding constraint to allow for policy of economic growth, with 2 branches, low returns and cost of finance. It was more specific and allowed for individual policies to be drawn up more easily based on the needs and wants of the country. The paper in itself has been influential for many other papers, showing the problems of generalization without taking social, political, and economic history of individual countries and looking at them as a case-by-case study. However, Roderick, a development economist that was involved in the growth diagnostic framework, says some big ideas may still exist, and not to throw big ideas out completely. The paper shows the history before each different big idea growth policies, especially before 1962 and 1982. This innovative overview allows the reader to understand the thinking of the development economists of the time, showing the logic and thought processes based on its historical and empirical results of the previous policies set out. This also showed the effects and failures of those policies and how they have adapted over time to shape based on changing evidence. The paper is similar in many other contemporary literature and development economists of challenging the wisdom of previous policy making, leaving such as all-knowing kind of big idea theories behind, and suggests for the diagnostic framework for sustainable development for the future. The paper calls to look at the stimulants that drives dynamically the growth of an economy. The paper also contributes to the idea that each institutions that are present in these countries are different and have to be taken on an individual case by case, rather than some universal, almost scientific method of developing an economy.
The lack of econometric and mathematical methods in the article is striking. These methods are essential for finding a range of insights that would help inform economic theory, which would allow for better policy, leading to economic growth and development. Another weakness relating to econometrics is the availability of data between developing and developed economies. While there can be very limiting amounts of data available between the two, the ways in which Lindahl and Pritchard use their limited data in this article is in a way that is trying to fit it to their needs. This observation is also made by R. S. Eckers in his critique of the article in the article's comments section. Speaking of data, it is clear that there is a selection bias towards the data used in this article. As there is no framework used in the article to exclude certain countries, the authors may have focused on countries that are doing relatively better or worse. As this article is focused on Latin America, one notable exclusion is that of Argentina during the Dirty War from 1974 to 1983, when about 30,000 leftist sympathizers were murdered by right-wing guerrillas, which were aided by the government. This in itself caused political instability and a slowdown in economic growth. Widespread corruption was also prevalent in Argentina at the time, hence another reason for the so-called lost decade. While the article does in fact suggest ideas, the article is very critical of previous policies. It goes very little into any recommendations for future policy or to suggest emerging themes that may help development economics in the future. Lindahl and Pritchard do not give enough weight to the political instability of any developing countries as a factor. It is nearly impossible for an economy to function when there is political instability. This may help make it clear to economists that politics and political events often trump economics. The article is very critical of previous big ideas and should perhaps not have disregarded them so quickly, as some countries, such as Taiwan and South Korea, succeed at using big ideas, and big ideas successfully led to growth and development in these nations. Different policies work at different times in different places, and even at different times in the same places. It would be a mistake to disregard the big ideas of the past, as there is no one-size-fits-all policy for all situations and all times. An outline and definition of which countries are to be included in the article and why would reduce the impression of selection bias by the authors. A wider selection of countries, and possibly a more geographical spread, would have also reduced elements of selection bias. Finally, the use of a more empirical approach to the author's evaluation of big ideas by using econometrics and other mathematical methods would have allowed for a more detailed analysis and a better understanding of these ideas, and not to simply disregard these methods. Econometric and mathematical methods have helped answer many questions in development economics, and they can help answer many more.
What's the Big Idea sets out to create a new path for economic development, encouraging a greater level of case-by-case analysis rather than basic instructions that do not address the specific needs of each country. The author's arguments state that a more detailed approach will achieve stronger growth in the long and short term.
The method of juxtaposing two different generations of big ideas is an effective approach in demonstrating Lindier and Pritchett's central arguments. The evidence provided is thoroughly researched and helps support these arguments.
Lindier and Pritchett, in critiquing other forms of literature and previous models of economic development policy, it joins wider literature by rejecting the conventional wisdom of big ideas and promoting diagnostic growth framework.
Finally, while the article is very critical of previous policies, it goes very little into any recommendations for future policy or to suggest emerging themes that may help the field of development economics in the future.